Imagine walking through the Topkapi Palace on a summer morning in 1643. The marble corridors are being cleared in a hurry. Servants are rushing women through side doors, eunuchs are bolting chambers from the outside, and viziers are standing in clusters, speaking in whispers. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire is about to lose control again, and when it happens, everyone knows what that means. Within minutes, Ibrahim I will be demanding sex from anyone within reach, ordering mass gatherings of concubines, inspecting women's bodies with manic intensity, and issuing state orders while in a condition that can only be described as sexual frenzy. The most powerful ruler in the Islamic world will need to be physically restrained and locked in his rooms until the episode passes. This happened multiple times a day. This was how the Ottoman Empire functioned for 8 years. This is the story of a sultan whose uncontrollable sexual compulsion destroyed him, terrorized his court, and nearly broke an empire. To understand how a man like this ended up ruling one of history's greatest powers, you have to start with what the Ottomans did to their princes. Ibrahim was born in 1615, the son of Sultan Ahmed I, into a dynasty that had turned royal succession into organized fratricide. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers were strangled with silk bowstrings to prevent civil wars. It was policy. It was tradition. And if you were a prince of the blood, it meant you lived every day knowing your brother might decide you were too dangerous to keep alive. Ibrahim watched this happen to his siblings one by one. His father died when he was 2. His uncle Mustafa I briefly ruled and was removed for mental instability. Then his older brother Murad IV took power, and Murad was a killer. He personally executed people for minor infractions. He led military campaigns with savage efficiency, and he kept Ibrahim alive but only in total isolation. From the age of 3 until he was 25 years old, Ibrahim lived in the Kafes, a section of the palace that was functionally a prison. He had no education, no training in governance, no contact with the outside world. He lived in a handful of rooms with eunuchs who wouldn't speak to him and concubines who were brought to him like food, silent women who existed only to serve his physical needs and then disappear. He spent 23 years waiting to be murdered, and that kind of captivity doesn't just scar you. It rewires your brain. When Murad IV died suddenly in 1640 from kidney failure caused by his own drinking, the Ottoman court found itself in an impossible position. There were no other princes. The only male left in the house of Osman was Ibrahim, the one they'd locked away and forgotten about. He became sultan by default, and from the first weeks of his reign, everyone around him knew something was catastrophically wrong. Ibrahim had been so isolated for so long that he didn't understand how to be around other people. He flinched at sudden movements. He wept randomly. He couldn't hold a conversation without drifting off. But more than that, he had developed a sexual obsession that consumed him. It wasn't just desire. It was compulsive, repetitive, and completely uncontrollable. Within a month of taking the throne, Ibrahim was having what the court began to call his episodes. He would be sitting in a state meeting or reviewing a petition, and then something would shift in his eyes. His attention would lock onto a woman in the room, or he would suddenly demand that the harem be opened immediately. He would insist on seeing dozens of women at once, ordering them lined up for inspection, examining their bodies with an intensity that frightened everyone present. These weren't seductions. They were frantic, manic episodes where Ibrahim seemed driven by something beyond rational thought. The court tried to manage it quietly at first. Advisors would attempt to redirect his attention, suggest he rest, delay his demands. But Ibrahim had absolute power, and when the compulsion hit him, he used that power without restraint. He would scream at officials who hesitated. He would threaten executions if his orders weren't followed immediately. He would grab at serving women who came near him, chase them through corridors if they tried to leave, corner them in rooms where they had no escape. The women of the palace, from the highest-ranking concubines to the lowest kitchen servants, learned to recognize when an episode was starting and to hide if they could. But you can't hide from the sultan in his own palace, and Ibrahim's need was relentless. He would demand sex multiple times a day, sometimes multiple times an hour. He would order the entire harem assembled so he could walk among them, touching, inspecting, selecting. The women had no ability to refuse. They were property. When the sultan wanted them, they complied, or they faced punishment, and Ibrahim wanted them constantly. What made this situation impossible to contain was that Ibrahim's sexual episodes didn't stay confined to his private chambers. They happened everywhere. During diplomatic receptions, Ibrahim would suddenly fixate on a female servant and leave the room to pursue her, abandoning foreign ambassadors mid-conversation. During military briefings, he would interrupt commanders to demand that concubines be brought to him immediately, forcing the empire's generals to stand awkwardly in the hallway while their sultan had sex in an adjoining room. During religious observations, which as sultan he was required to lead, Ibrahim would become visibly aroused and distracted, his attention drifting to any woman in his line of sight. The pattern was always the same. The compulsion would hit him, his behavior would become erratic and aggressive, and the court would scramble to manage the situation. Officials developed an informal protocol. When they saw the signs, they would begin clearing the corridors of women as quickly as possible. Servants would take alternate routes through the palace. The harem would go into lockdown, with the eunuchs reinforcing doors and moving the younger concubines to interior rooms where they couldn't be seen. And then, if the episode was severe enough, they would lock Ibrahim himself in his chambers. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire would be physically barred in his rooms from the outside, not as punishment, but as the only way to prevent him from sexually assaulting every woman he encountered. This wasn't occasional. This was the reality of governing under Ibrahim. Multiple times a day, sometimes 5 or 6 times, the entire palace would shift into crisis mode because the Sultan had lost control again. And during these episodes, Ibrahim was still giving orders. He was still making decisions that affected millions of people across the empire, but he was making them while in a state of sexual arousal so intense that he couldn't focus on anything else. He would promote men to high office because someone mentioned their name at the wrong moment and he was too distracted to process the information properly. He would sign execution orders because he was irritated at being interrupted. He would approve military campaigns or reverse existing policies without any clear reasoning, and his viziers would be left trying to figure out if these were actual decisions or just the random output of a mind overwhelmed by compulsion. Often, when the episode passed and Ibrahim returned to something resembling lucidity, he would have no memory of what he'd ordered. Officials learned to delay implementing his commands, waiting to see if he would contradict himself once he calmed down. The empire was being governed in the gaps between the sultan's breakdowns. The harem itself became a nightmare. Ibrahim didn't just want sex. He wanted variety, novelty, specific physical types that he obsessed over with manic focus. He became fixated on large women, particularly those of unusual size and weight. Sources from the period describe his fascination with a concubine who was enormously obese by the standards of the time, and how this turned into a compulsion to find more women who matched that specific body type. He sent agents throughout the empire searching for the heaviest women they could find, bringing them back to Constantinople to stock the harem according to his specifications. He developed a separate obsession with fur, ordering his chambers lined with sable pelts and insisting that women wear fur during sex even in the brutal summer heat. The palace stank of sweat and animal hide and the unwashed bodies of hundreds of women locked in overcrowded quarters. Ibrahim would demand mass inspections, ordering all the concubines assembled so he could walk among them, groping, measuring, examining them like livestock. He developed theories about fertility and sexual capacity based on physical measurements, conducting what he apparently believed were experiments, selecting women based on hip width or breast size or height and then recording the results of his encounters with them. The women endured this because they had no choice. They were slaves. When the Sultan wanted to use their bodies for his compulsions, they submitted, and if they resisted, they were punished. And then there were the rapes that happened outside the harem structure entirely. Ibrahim would see a serving woman in a corridor and simply take her, sometimes in semi-public spaces where other people had to pretend not to notice. He would fixate on the wives or daughters of officials visiting the palace and demand they be brought to him, creating impossible situations where men had to choose between their family's honor and their sultan's wrath. There are records of complaints from officials whose female relatives were assaulted during palace visits, complaints that were quietly buried because there was no mechanism to hold the Sultan accountable. Ibrahim's behavior was known throughout Constantinople. Foreign ambassadors reported it back to their governments. Traders and travelers spread stories across the empire. Everyone knew that the Ottoman Sultan was sexually uncontrollable, that women were not safe around him, and that the court was barely managing to contain the situation. And yet the empire continued to function, because the administrative machinery of the Ottoman state was sophisticated enough to operate despite its ruler. Viziers made the real decisions. The Valide Sultan, Ibrahim's mother Kösem, wielded power in her son's name. Provincial governors acted with increasing autonomy. The empire governed itself around Ibrahim's incapacity. But you can't sustain that forever, especially when the sultan's condition is deteriorating rather than stabilizing. By the mid-1640s, Ibrahim's episodes were lasting longer, coming more frequently, and becoming more violent. He was no longer just sexually aggressive. He was paranoid. He began to suspect the women around him of infidelity, which was absurd given that they were imprisoned concubines with no access to other men. But Ibrahim's mind was no longer processing reality in a rational way. In 1644, during one of his paranoid episodes, Ibrahim became convinced that his concubines were betraying him. The specifics of what triggered this belief are unclear, and probably irrelevant. What matters is what he did next. Ibrahim ordered that his entire harem be drowned. Not a handful of women he suspected, not even a specific group. All of them. Nearly 300 women were sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. The executions took days. Bodies washed ashore along the strait for weeks afterward. This was not statecraft. This was not even cruelty in the service of power. This was a man so disconnected from reality that he could order the mass murder of hundreds of people and believe it was a reasonable response to his sexual jealousy. The drowning of the harem was the moment when everyone in the Ottoman leadership understood that Ibrahim could not continue as sultan. His mother knew it. The viziers knew it. The military commanders knew it. Even the religious authorities, who had enormous influence over questions of legitimacy, knew it. The problem was that removing a sultan was not a simple matter. It required consensus among the empire's power brokers. It required a replacement heir. And it required a willingness to acknowledge that the system had failed. For 4 more years after the drowning, the Ottoman Empire continued under Ibrahim's nominal rule while everyone at court worked around him. His mother forged his signature on documents. His advisors made decisions and attributed them to him retroactively. His condition was an open secret that everyone pretended wasn't happening. But by 1648, the fiction could no longer be maintained. Ibrahim's episodes were now happening so frequently that he was essentially non-functional as a ruler. He would have lucid periods that lasted only hours before the compulsion overtook him again. The court was spending more time managing his breakdowns than governing the empire. On August 8, 1648, the decision was made. Ibrahim was deposed in a palace coup that was remarkably swift and almost bureaucratic in its execution. He was removed from his chambers, stripped of his authority, and imprisoned in the same rooms where he'd spent his childhood. His 6-year-old son Mehmed was declared sultan, with the regency council taking actual power. And then, 10 days later, Ibrahim was strangled. The method was traditional, silk bowstrings, the same way the Ottomans had been executing inconvenient princes for centuries. The official justification was insanity, which was accurate as far as it went. But the real reason was simpler. The empire could no longer afford a sultan who had to be locked away multiple times a day to prevent him from sexually assaulting everyone around him and issuing random orders that destabilized the government. Ibrahim I had ruled for 8 years, and for most of that time, he had been functionally incapacitated by a sexual compulsion he could not control and a trauma-damaged mind that made him dangerous to himself and everyone near him. From a modern medical perspective, what happened to Ibrahim was probably a combination of severe complex PTSD from his decades of isolation, an underlying condition like bipolar disorder or obsessive-compulsive disorder that was never diagnosed or treated, and hypersexuality as a symptom of both. 23 years of solitary confinement during his formative years would have been enough to cause permanent psychological damage on its own. Add to that the constant fear of execution, the complete absence of normal human relationships, and then suddenly being given absolute power with no preparation or support, and you have a recipe for catastrophic mental breakdown. In the 17th century, none of this was understood in medical terms. Ibrahim was simply insane, unfit, dangerous. There was no treatment, no therapy, no medication. There was only containment, and when containment failed, there was removal. The Ottoman Empire survived Ibrahim. His son Mehmed IV ruled for nearly 40 years, though the real power remained with viziers and the military. The administrative structures proved more resilient than the man at the top. But Ibrahim's reign left scars. The harem system was reformed, with greater oversight and restrictions on the sultan's access. The practice of confining princes in the Kafes was eventually modified because it had become clear that it produced rulers who were psychologically damaged. The empire had learned, at enormous cost, that you cannot lock a man away for decades and expect him to function as a leader when you finally need him. And more than that, the empire had learned that crowns do not cure, that absolute power cannot compensate for a broken mind, and that biology does not care about your title. Ibrahim I was sultan of one of the most powerful empires on earth, and he spent his reign being locked in his rooms by his own servants because his sexual compulsion made him too dangerous to be around. That's not a metaphor. That's not an exaggeration. That is what happened. An empire of millions, stretching across 3 continents, governed by a man who couldn't control his own body long enough to sign a document without stopping to assault whoever was nearby. History remembers the great sultans, the conquerors, and the builders. But it also has to remember the ones like Ibrahim, because they tell us something important about power and human fragility. You can have all the authority in the world, and it means nothing if your mind is destroying itself. The Ottoman court could build magnificent palaces, maintain enormous armies, administrate complex bureaucracies spanning continents, and still find itself helpless against the sexual compulsion of one broken man on a throne. That is what remains from Ibrahim I, not the battles, not the architecture, but the memory of a sultan who had to be caged by his own empire because the alternative was chaos.